to another episode of Your Dose, the podcast where we speak to individuals with lived mental health experiences to help people feel less alone and more connected. Today I am speaking with Brandon about his mental health journey, covering bipolar disorder, OCD, exercise dependence, eating disorders, and so much more. Brandon shares the impact on his school life, isolation, and self-image. He also discusses psychiatric hospitals, challenges of being on an older ward, and how his running addiction intertwined with mental health. Brandon's story highlights men's mental health, the importance of embracing differences, and also the negative impacts of grief. Thank you so much for being here and listening to the podcast today. As always, if you do listen to my podcast, please remember to follow or subscribe, depending on the channel that you are listening on today. And if you are dealing with any of the topics that we discuss in today's episode, please do remember to seek professional support. If you are listening today and it is after the Christmas period or almost before the Christmas period, I hope you have a lovely Christmas and a very happy New Year. And thank you so much to all my regular listeners. I'm so excited for next year to bring you lots more interesting topics on mental health with even more incredible guests. Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Your Dose. Today we have Brandon. Hello Brandon.
Hi, thanks for having me on today.
You're welcome. I'm so excited to speak to you. Where are you based? I'm guessing the US, but whereabouts?
So outside of around Dayton, Ohio currently, so bottom part of Ohio.
And what time is it there?
It is currently 6:10 p.m.
So not too bad. So this is my first ever recording in Australia. And I was really worried about coming here because I was like, how am I going to get guests on my podcast? Because I have a lot of people outside of the UK, but so you're Eastern Standard Time Zone, so that's not actually that bad. It's my morning,
Not at all.
your evening.
Yeah, it works out good that way, actually.
Yeah, it actually works out way better because I'm a morning person and I know some people are evening people. So that's worked out well. Do you like have a normal job? Do you work from home?
So I do a lot of volunteering currently, and then advocacy work as well. So as well as a podcast that I host it's been around for a year and 3 months, I think.
So we will talk a little bit more about your podcast when we get a little bit more into the episode. But I always feel nervous when I'm speaking to someone who's already an experienced podcaster. But just very briefly, what is your podcast? What's it called? And what's it about?
Yeah, so the podcast is called Empower Half an Hour, all one word. And it is a mental health podcast that focuses on recovery. And it covers a variety of topics. So we do testimonials and as well as mental health professional interviews. And we also have been getting into looking at organizations that specialize in mental health and breaking down what they do. So showing different parts of the organization and the amazing work that goes within. We actually, in our first year, we were able to reach 12 different countries and 27 states of the US to really get impacted and show the amazing work of people.
That's so cool. And what does Empower Half an Hour mean? Is there any significance behind that?
Yeah, so it's one is just empowering individuals that are oftentimes with mental health conditions, it really can take our self-esteem and just make it go down so much. And when we look at like recovery and showing a testimonial, it really shows with Empower, you can empower someone to be the best person they can be. And really, Ultimately, it was a name process we went through as well, through the organization that I'm with, and we came up with that, and it fit pretty well.
Very cool. Well, I will have a listen to your podcast. My life's been everywhere at the moment, but need to have a listen. And really appreciate you coming on here today. So, as always, we're here to talk about your mental health journey. So, I guess taking it back, what has your mental health journey been so far, and how did you come to getting the diagnosis for whatever it is that you're diagnosed with?
Yeah, so mine actually started back. So the first symptoms I really noticed was age 6, and I'll start by just saying my diagnosis, so it kind of makes sense. So I am diagnosed currently with bipolar 1 disorder with psychotic features, OCD, generalized anxiety disorder, anorexia nervosa, and then I have childhood trauma as well. But the first symptoms were really at age 6, and when I was in early parts of school, so kindergarten, I really started having some thoughts that were very strange to me. It was one of those things that a 6-year-old child shouldn't be thinking these thoughts. And with the thoughts, they were deeming people that I meet either contaminated or not contaminated. And it's a very extreme thought that I didn't like because it was judging someone, and I don't like to judge people. But it was part of the OCD that I was diagnosed with at age 11. And part of course, that's the intrusive thought of having people deemed contaminated or non-contaminated. My compulsion at that point was to avoid them and at all costs just kind of stay away from them. And it never really made sense on what overall was making me deem them contaminated. Some of it came from like hygiene. Some of it was just it just felt something in my brain was just like that's what it is, and it brought anxiety.
So, in terms of the contamination side of things, obviously you're not wanting to engage with people. Did that mean that you didn't have many friends and spent a lot of time quite isolated?
It did. Yeah, school for me from kindergarten through 12th grade was very difficult. Mainly just because of all the mental health conditions popping up. And of course, with the contamination, it was one of those things that it was ruling my life at an early age. And of course, that wasn't the only part of OCD I have. I have multiple other subtypes with it. But that was the first one that really popped up, and it did cause a lot of isolation and also people really bullying me as well, because if someone avoids someone and they don't give a reason, especially at a young age, it's kind of looked on a little bit differently.
So obviously it all started off with this OCD contamination theme. Then what happened? How did it evolve from there? Because obviously you have now a multitude of diagnoses.
Yeah, so it really so I started having panic attacks a lot more often. I thought it was a food allergy at first. My parents thought it was a food allergy, and of course I went to the hospital. They could do nothing because by that time it de-escalated and I was done. But it was a pattern that was beginning that was of strange like behaviors, and it can kind of put two to two together once you're after the diagnosis, once you're like, oh well, that's what it was. But my father, when I was 7, ended up having cancer. He was diagnosed with stage 4 non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and that was one of my long-term traumas, and that lasted from the age of 7 until I was 18 when my father passed away. And it was one of those things that it changed the ability to live life, because cancer doesn't just affect the person, it's also the family and everyone around them. And being at a young age of 7, it's very confusing, trying to navigate what's going on and then also maintain life and maintain, what a 7-year-old should be doing. And it was one of those things that, looking back now, it plays a major role in who I am today.
Oh, that's awful. Like, I can't even imagine what it must have been like to lose a family member at such a young age. Like, I can't even comprehend it. But taking it back a little bit, something that you mentioned, which was quite interesting in a way, just something that I wanted to go into a little bit more, was you mentioned that you thought that your panic attacks was a food allergy. Is that right? What was it that what were the symptoms that you were experiencing that would make you think it was a food allergy?
Yeah, so I was initially having them at dinner time or lunchtime, and it was because of the building anxiety of just overall like daily life, and when it happened, it looks very similar.
And so this was kind of, I guess, like linked with the OCD, anxiety, sort of comorbid to each other. When did you and how did you get diagnosed with bipolar, but specifically bipolar with psychotic features, and what was the symptoms that you were experiencing for that?
Yeah, so so I had the trauma, the beginning of the trauma with my father, and seeing him suffer so much, and that just made a lot of things, I think, escalate, really, because sometimes mental illness can be triggered from like major life events and things like that.
Yeah.
But it was at age 11. Well, let me backtrack a little bit. So I was also dealing with depression during probably my 5th grade year. A lot of things going on at that point in life, but I never really had a manic episode. So when I first was diagnosed at age 11, it was more just a major depression. But there's one night, I remember this night so vividly at times, and it's in and out, because with psychosis, you lose touch with realities often. But I had just had my 11th birthday, and I was getting ready to go into my 6th grade year of school. And this night was midsummer. It was one of those nights where everything was going kind of normal until I laid down to go to sleep. And I started, dissociating a bit, and then I started hearing things. So I was having auditory hallucinations, and then I was also having visual ones and tactile. So feeling spiders crawling under my skin and
Oh my gosh.
seeing things all around my room. And it was one of those things that, like, as a parent, there's no manual when you have children. There's not anything that's going to tell you that your child might have a mental illness. And that was very much the case for my parents, because they came in that night, and this was probably at 1 a.m, and I was staring into space, losing touch with my surroundings, and hearing a lot of auditory hallucinations. From one of my big ones was sirens, like police sirens. So it was very overwhelming, and it was very traumatizing for my parents, because oftentimes when someone is going through psychosis, their eyes might look kind of glazed over and just lost. It was one of those things that they were trying to figure out what to do with me.
Wow. Do you remember like how it felt in that moment when you were seeing all these things and hearing things, and like you're 11 years old? What do you remember thinking? Were you so lost in this like moment that you, sorry, I'll have to edit that out.
No, you're good.
Were you so lost in this moment that you like didn't have time to think, or like did you think it was a dream? I don't know. I can't imagine being 11 years old and hallucinating.
It was one of those things that, like, the hallucinations, being that I have a long history with them, but when I go into the full psychotic episodes, it's one of those things that I start to lose touch with the reality, and I also might forget some things along the way, because it's just like losing yourself completely. The actual hallucinations were very terrifying at first, because then that triggered the response of being paranoid. And especially when we look at the ones that with the police sirens, because it's one of those things that usually when you hear them, you want to look and see where they are. But being that's an auditory hallucination, I couldn't find it. I looked out the window. I was very,
Oh gosh.
I was kind of panicking at that point, because it was so new to me. And I mean, I was just 11 years old, and this was so unusual, because I had never, in and before my episode and then after, I had no way of finding another person and being like, do you also get hallucinations? Do you also see things? And it's just not something that was talked about, and that's what made it even more scary too.
And how was it how was it treated? Was it, because you were 11 then, obviously you've got the OCD as well. What did your parents do? And then how long did it take to receive the official diagnosis of bipolar with psychotic features?
Mm-hmm. So at the moment, so I was in the middle of the psychotic episode, and my parents were trying to figure out what the best options were. And I had, a little bit before that, I had started counseling, because they noticed those symptoms and those unusual things, and they thought it'd be the best idea to try counseling. And that was a good first step, first of all. I mean, that's when we look at prevention, that's a really good way to start with counseling if you notice things. But with it escalating so quickly that night, they really had to look for psychiatric hospitals in the area. And one thing with the US is, I mean, our mental health care system is okay, but it's still very broken. It's still one of those things that needs a lot of attention. And we found that out very quickly. That was, so I think it was about 16 years ago right now. And now it's gotten better, but it still needs a lot of work. Back when I was experiencing this, my parents found a psychiatric hospital for adolescents, and I was put in the car. And I remember this. I have one brother as well. So they got me into the driveway, and I took off running, because I was paranoid. I was very scared, and I didn't know what to do. And my brother, I ran after me and got me back on track and got me to the car. And they were, and this, I mean, keep in mind, this was like 1 a.m. It wasn't like broad daylight where it was everything happening. But we got to the psychiatric hospital, and my first moments I remember of it was, one, the facility was very not taken care of. There was a police officer waiting at the door, all the standard precautions. But as a child, those are terrifying, because, especially if you feel you've done nothing wrong, which the truth is you have done nothing wrong. It's a mental health crisis. But as a child, you feel like you've done something horribly wrong, especially seeing a police officer, because we often associate, police officers with when you do something wrong. But once I was in the intake process, it takes hours to get everything. By the time you start it, to getting admitted into the hospital. And the one thing that caused trauma with this was my height. And the reason I say that is I'm 6'6" currently, but back then I was above my height, like above normal. So they put me in with 13-year-olds to 18-year-olds instead of the 11 and below, which should have never happened, because the things you learn in a psychiatric hospital, being with people that are older than you, and also if you're emotionally not mature yet, because I wasn't even a preteen at that point, and I was being put in with anyone, and it was a 3-day stay, and it was the first of many, many stays. I've been in and out of psychiatric care for at least like 12 or 13 stays at this point. But
so, yeah, I mean, just a few questions there.
mhm.
I mean, just on the height thing, which is quite interesting. So I'm actually 5 foot. And I wondered, just on an off side note, like, have you been discriminated against? Obviously, there's something else I want to ask you, which is related to what you just spoke about being in the older ward. But obviously, we're on the two levels. So like, I've been like the other day, I did a story about I was literally like verbally abused on a night out here. And I mean, all my life I've been bullied for my height, like literally all the time. But I don't know if anyone's listening from Australia, please don't take this as an offensively, but I think it's kind of a little bit backwards here. And it's like, they've never seen a small person before. Like, I'm small, but I'm not like abnormal. Do you know? It's like, it's just one of those things. Like, I'm just a small person. And yeah, it hurts and it's not very nice. And I wonder, is that something that you experience as a tall person?
I think that a lot of time with modern day society, people get defined by their height, and they get defined whether it's a positive or a negative. And I, over the years, have had a lot of experiences, and I've experimented with, with my responses. And one that I respond to when someone will tell me I'm tall, I say, well, I'm so much more than that. And, it wasn't like that as, growing up, because I was always just trying to get used to it. And I think it's really a horrible thing that people get so hung up on a height standpoint, because they aren't looking at the person. They're looking at attributes to what you are. And I also look at it like, further into my journey, I was in treatment, and if I'm up, like you said, you were 5 foot. So if someone who's 5 foot and a female is a staff member at one of these treatment centers, they might feel, threatened or scared if I raise my voice a little bit, if I'm frustrated, because then I feel like I can't show my emotions, because I am a little bit taller than, some of them. And then I'm like, I mean nothing to you, I'm just expressing my emotions. And, it's the same on the other side when you talk about, having like 5 foot. I mean, there's nothing wrong with any height whatsoever, but society then looks at it as another way. And it's same with, like, in America, if you're tall, everybody asks, do you play basketball? And growing up, I played no sports. My life was consumed of mental illness. And it was hard for me to kind of get past that, because, like, what do I answer? What do I say? I mean, I'm going through things, and That's really what I think is the hardest part when people look at attributes.
Yeah. I think that it's like, for me, it's complete off topic, but with height, it's something that you cannot change. And to me, it's very much on the same, not exactly the same, but similar level to like racism, because it's the color of someone's skin is something that they're born with. And if somebody is racially abused about the color of their skin, it's like, well, but I can't change that. That's who I am as a person. And that's the same for me when someone says I'm small. It's like, I know it's very obvious that I'm small, but like, I wish I could be taller, but I can't be. So, and it's weird because people feel so able to make those comments about like someone's height, but yet if it was, people might think twice if it's racism. Anyway, yeah, but we'll go on to that. So the question that I had was, obviously you were on this older ward, which I can't believe they put that on anyway. I've worked on psychiatric wards myself, so I've been that 5-foot person that's been shouted at. And I've seen the way that both children, adolescent wards work, but then also adult wards work, in terms of, especially with children and adolescents, is like somebody's picks up a certain way to self-harm, and then that like snowballs throughout the rest of the ward, and especially guys together when they're both mentally ill, they're going through like they're becoming a teenager, or they're going through like the puberty stage as well, and they definitely like feed off each other. So the question was, would you be comfortable sharing some of these some of these behaviors that you're engaging with whilst on this older ward?
Absolutely, yeah. So, I learned a lot of seeing, for one, patients with cutting history, and that's a very common one. And it was also something that in my head, it kind of messed up my healing process. And the reason I say that is I associated the word self-harm with cutting, because at that age you're uneducated, you don't know a lot about what you're seeing, and that long term really messed up, because I engaged over my life a lot of different self-harm, and I didn't classify myself as someone that would self-harm, even though I had an extensive history, because in my mind, and also having like a black and white thinking pattern at that time, I only saw it as, if I'm not cutting myself, then I'm not self-harming, which that was just one of those things that at the young of age you don't understand what you're seeing.
Yeah. And how long were you, so you were on that ward for 3 days or weeks?
3 days for that. And I was actually, I didn't have a psychiatrist when I was discharged, so they placed me with someone, and that was one of those things that it made my recovery process so much harder, because they didn't do the medication properly. With psychiatric medications, you have to give them time to build up in your system, and you can't just put it on and then take it off the next day or the next week. And this particular psychiatrist would do that, and not really seeing much progress and change. When you're growing up, your body is changing, so I couldn't really keep a good stable amount of medicine in me to get me stable.
So after this, so you've been in and out of psychiatric hospitals pretty much, like, I mean, all your life so far. What was the longest period of time that you were ever in a psychiatric hospital?
So my average stay now, I mean, the first one was 3, and that was just because of I couldn't stay in. But my average is about 2 to 3 weeks each time I go in. I was going in 2 times a year, 1 to 2 times per year, while trying to get through school, because with the school system, there was no way for me to recover. I was could do education and also mental health at the same time. I mean, I made it. I did get my degree, my graduate degree for high school, but it was without sacrifice. I ended up having nothing to show for like a social life or anything else. And with being in and out of the hospitals for so much, I was also learning the coping strategies. I was learning, really just discovering what works for me. And I also was finding that I was treatment resistant for a lot of medication, but also going back to the diagnosis piece, I found that I no longer had depression anymore. It was my third stay, I believe. I had my first manic episode in the hospital, and the doctor saw it, and they were very clearly like, there is no way that it's just depression, and they saw both sides.
And that was the bipolar.
Yeah.
And that's what did that manic episode look like?
So it was very high energy. It was, so I had some delusions of grandeur at times. There was really just risky behaviors inside the hospital. I remember this specific hospital had like a workout room that once a week you could go in, and I was probably 13 at this time, but I jumped off one of the equipment and ended up hitting my leg and scraped it up pretty bad and didn't feel a thing. I was just so high on my episode. There's obviously the lack of sleep as well. So my sleep patterns changed, and I was having less of a need for sleep and more energy coming out of it. And since that stay specifically, my diagnosis has stayed with bipolar 1.
Wow. I mean, how many manic episodes have you had since that, do you think? Is it common, or does it typically, because I've had people on this podcast where they talk about manic episodes, not panic episodes, and they'll have like maybe like a few a year, but is this something like at that sort of level that you would experience often?
So it was. Right now, currently, I've been able to stay pretty stable without it, just because I'm on very high doses of medication and mood stabilizers to really, keep me from going in that manic episode. But when I was an adolescent, I was still body changing, and my medications weren't enough. So I would go in. Hard to say. I mean, it's that whole time frame gets jumbled, but a couple times a year. And I'd also be in the depressive as well, and I'd get psychosis in both the depressive episodes and the manic episodes, and they're so much different than there's two different types really, because when I'm in a manic episode and have psychosis, I am much more agitated. I am very argumentative. I dissociate, and it's more of a manageable one for me, at least. When I'm in my psychotic episode, in a depression state, it's much more on the scarier side. I'm having a lot more hallucinations that mimic in a way, I always say I don't watch horror movies for a reason, because I've lived a horror movie within my head, going through these, these hallucinations, these in and out of realities.
Yeah. So moving on a little bit to the anorexia. So I was diagnosed with anorexia when I was 15. You are the third man that I've had on here who has had an eating disorder. And I think it's so important to talk about. It's quite interesting because my number one played episode was a a guy who spoke about his experience with an eating disorder. And I think that's because it is something which is not spoken about, especially not anorexia in men. So yeah, if you wouldn't mind sharing your journey with anorexia and how did that fit into this whole like almost ecosystem of like other diagnoses that you've had?
Yeah. So that's a really good question. And I think it started way earlier in life than I realized. And so I probably had more so like as a child, ARFID, so avoidant food restriction disorder.
Yeah.
And I just didn't know it. Coming into that, I mean, there was a lot of like evidence supporting that, but I also was, as a child, very, I was on the underweight side. So then after starting taking medications, obviously there's side effects. And having those side effects, I gained a whole bunch of weight because of the antipsychotic. It was one of those things that it happened quickly, it happened all at once, and it, in my mind, ruined my life at that time, not now, but it was one of those things that it took my my self-esteem and it ruined it, and my confidence, and it ruined it because I was so frustrated that I had this weight gain from the medication, and it was one of those things that it stuck with me for so long. And I had to go to a like a clinic to at one point, like, you know, they'd promote losing weight, and, you know, of course, going to that setting, like before having anorexia, that was a treasure trove for the stuff they don't want you to know when you're, you know, with anorexia, all the ways to lose weight. And that's really what got stuck in my head. And it was the professionals saying, you need to lose weight, you need to, you know, all these reinforcements that just kind of structured a picture in my head that I was constantly needing to lose weight, and I couldn't do it. I was having those body image problems probably around age 12 by the time the medicine had the weight gain. But I continued to have that happen, and then from long-term use of my one medication, I had my thyroid get damaged, and I lost a significant amount of weight all in 3 months. And I had my quote unquote, there's no, you know, really ideal body, but in my disordered way, I had my ideal body. And the hardest part was, obviously, when you lose weight, you don't get rid of the body image issues. You don't have it, that, you know, they don't go together, unfortunately. So I was miserable. I was looking at myself in the mirror. The body checking was starting. It was so strong at that point. And having the body dysmorphia at that point as well, it was horrible. But I mentioned also that I never really did any sports because of the mental illness, and this is where it gets interesting in a way. So at age 22, I had tried a 5K, and this was just, I had like the opportunity come up, and I tried it, and I loved it. And it was a little bit easier to run. I had less weight on me, and I had that like, okay, I'll try it out. And I decided out of nowhere, like in the wintertime, it was time, I'm going to try a half marathon. And this was the biggest thought I've had of anything when it comes to exercise in my life. And I joined a running group actually in the early spring. And it was with all ages, not really young people, because I wasn't fast enough for the, you know, the more elite groups and all of that. But I started, you know, seeing the running was bringing me joy. And I also didn't realize that I was starting an obsession on it. I was starting to only think about it. And the one thing about having multiple diagnoses, they interact with each other. So I wasn't just having a running addiction, I was also having manic episodes all through that time. So the
Yeah.
running, the brain chemistry was triggering those manic episodes and triggering the delusions. So I was having, at one point I thought I could run from the bottom of Ohio to the top of Ohio. And I, in my mind, that's what I thought I could do, because it's not realistic when I'm not in a delusion. But when I am in a delusion, it looks very manageable to run 300 some miles and also try to set a world record, because it's not logical in your mind. But I didn't realize
Yeah.
that. And then when looking at how it progressed, so I was running with this group and really kind of socializing and learning about the running world and everything that goes with it. And this was all foreign to me. I also, around that time, decided I needed to lose more weight. And this is where it really got tricky. I started, maybe I'll skip a meal. Maybe, I'll just keep running a bit. And, that's a very difficult process, because once you do it once, then it kind of becomes an obsession even more. And I also was restricting my fluid intake. So I didn't really have the interest to hydrate and eat as much after my running that I did. And I didn't realize what was going on around me, because when you're in that state, you don't realize the impact it has on others. I didn't realize that all I would talk about was running. All I cared about was running. I was losing myself in a way that I hadn't experienced before. I was in my mind, I was in the best state I've ever been in my life. And
Yeah.
yeah.
I can completely resonate. I mean, I think you actually commented on my picture with the half marathon thing. Like, I have such a weird relationship with running in particular. So, like, I'm very much into the gym now. It's strength training. Like, I will always, probably like you, be body conscious. Like, I think I still have body dysmorphia to a certain extent in some ways. I have good and bad days, probably like you do. But there is no other form of exercise which affects me like running does. And luckily with the half marathon, it was fine. But I can like completely understand. Like, I would wake up every day, do a 10K. I wouldn't stop at my friend's house. Like, I was 15, so like I wouldn't go to like a sleepover if they were having one, because I'd have to be up for a run the next day. Like, if I for some reason missed a run or I was like getting ill, my whole world would be like collapsing because I couldn't engage in this activity. And it's weird, the more that I've like understood myself and like seen my OCD traits, that I think that it was never actually, it was an eating disorder, but it was an eating disorder as a subsequent of having OCD. Because like, it is like, if you think like an eating disorder is like this obsession around like your weight, and then the compulsion is to stop eating or check your calories. And then the same thing with exercise. And for me was that mine started as exercise. So it was never about the food. It was like, I was never into sport, hated running, hated any form of exercise. And yeah, exactly the same thing. One of my friends was like, let's go for a run. And I hated it, but then I became addicted to the feeling, like that runner's high, and became obsessed because of my OCD, I think. And it's something that I actually wanted to ask you on, which kind of like links to this, is what do you think is like the comorbidity of all these disorders? Because it's kind of interesting because is it like, do you think that it's like you are all of these things, or do you just suffer with mental health issues and they all kind of like very different, but like all like kind of like intertwine? Does that make sense?
Yeah, you're right on point with all of it. And the thing is, they're so intertwined that when one goes down, another one pops up. So the more mental health conditions that you have, the more when my OCD is better, then my eating disorder pops up. But when my
something
eating
else
disorder,
is gonna,
yeah, exactly. And it's like whack-a-mole. You're constantly trying to keep up, and you can never get ahead unless you are having those self-care and everything lined up in the correct way. And with eating disorders, there is a link to OCD, and having having both of those is common. And that's, I think, really what it stems to. And when I was looking at my running addiction, the OCD has a lot of influence on it. And that's why, when we look at the running addiction part, it's a feeling, like you said, the running high, it's a feeling like no other. And especially like for me, with having a manic episode during that time, it was one of those things that like, it was so fueling my existence that my life was spiraling. And that leads me into actually the next part, which was really the peak of my running addiction, when I had signed up for the half marathon, and I decided to run with the marathon training group, because the half marathon one didn't start until a couple months later, and I was like, I need to just get something to do. And I had my first 20-mile run at that one point, and it was like 4 hours time frame to get it done. But that kind of was one thing that really got complicated, because in Ohio we have some extreme weather conditions, so like it gets really hot on the summers. And being that you're so far gone with a running addiction, you'll do anything to get that fix, or you're running high in that case. So one of the things my OCD was really attached to was the mileage, and mapping out every single like part of the run. So I decided I was going to do a 20-mile run on my own without the group. And it was about 95 degrees when I set out. And we have humidity in Ohio. So it was probably like early 100-degree temperatures. And I also had not been drinking that much. So I was very restricted on my fluids, and probably dehydrated at that point without knowing it. I also was very restrictive on my food as well. And my 20-mile run I did with the group for 4 hours was no longer. This run that was out in the 100-degree temperature was 7 hours. And the one thing with an addiction is you will not stop, and it controls your life so much. And I got out and I was running. The time was going by. I didn't realize I didn't care, actually, how long it was going to take me, as long as I got 20 miles in. And I did. I ended up getting home very dehydrated, very sick. But I put a post on Facebook, and this is one thing that changed everything, because I had always struggled with my identity growing up, because I just really struggled of finding one for myself. But one of my running friends first said, 20 miles is over your half marathon limit that you wanted to do. You might as well just switch to the full marathon. And the other thing he said, and I remember this so often, now you're a runner. And those words controlled my life. They're the best thing that happened to me and the worst thing that happened to me, because one, that gave me an identity. At least I thought it did. It was, at the time, it was the best thing that could happen. And then also it fueled everything, because, when you have those words in your head that I'm a runner now, I'm a runner, it fuels the obsession.
Got to keep up with it then, haven't you?
Yeah, exactly. And it's one of those things that shortly after, when I switched to the full marathon, it was upcoming, and I found out I had a hairline fracture on my foot. And of course, with addictions, it doesn't listen to logic, and it doesn't listen to the doctors saying, yeah, you probably shouldn't be running that marathon in a couple weeks. Logically, I did the crutches for like 2 or 3 weeks, And then in my mind, I was magically healed. There was nothing wrong with my foot. There was nothing wrong with my life. There was nothing wrong with anything. And the day of the marathon came. And this was the worst but best day of my life. And there's a reason for this. So again, it was about 100 degrees, and the course had a flag system. And once it got to a black flag, they canceled the race. So I was running, and I got to mile 20, and they canceled the race on me. My first race, doing a marathon, first obsession, and I didn't realize it. So my mother was at the race as well. She was waiting for me at the finish line, and she knew me. She, is my mother. And she knew that I was, one, extremely far gone. And number two, I would not stop. And I would do that 26.2 mile run if it killed me. And having that knowledge was pure terror for her to stand on those sidelines waiting for me to get bused to the finish line and walk across the finish line. And this was the reality check. This was the point where I realized I had something wrong with me. Because going up to this, I thought I was just on top of the world. But my running friend who didn't do the race was there at that finish line and took me aside and was giving me, he was making me realize that I needed electrolytes, number one. I needed to sit down, and I don't get up. I was trying to get up. You sit right back down. He understood what was happening to me. And I realized that it was something far worse.
So what did you do from that moment about your running addiction?
So from there, I was starting to see a dietitian, and this dietitian specialized in eating disorders and said, "You are not allowed to run. You are not going to be able to do this. And anyone with an addiction, you can't just stop cold turkey with an addiction." And it's hard. And that's where we go over to the self-harm area, and I began purging. And I did purging for 2 weeks and lost myself even more. I am a very rule-following person because just part of my thought process is it terrifies me to go anywhere close to breaking any rules. But when I was purging, I lost that because purging is just like another addiction. And I got so consumed by it that I went anywhere to hide from the people I love, hide from the fact that I was doing something that was so shameful to me. And that's the one thing with eating disorders. There is so much shame tied to all of our behaviors. And it's not that we do this to damage the people that we love. It's not that we do this because we want to damage ourselves. It's a illness that consumes us to the point where we don't know who we are. We just are doing the motions, and we're doing these motions to satisfy sometimes past trauma. And for me, that's what it was. I had at that point an extensive history of trauma with my father, with treatment trauma, medical trauma, and I was hurting. I had lost my father 3 years, 4 years before that, and I was so lost in my life. There's society has these standards on what your 20s should look like. And let me tell you right now, it's nothing that you should pay attention to. Do it as many, find your own pathways. And I did not do that. I tried to do, live to these expectations, and my eating disorder was so frustrating because I didn't meet these. And I also found that ever since my father passed away, since he went through so much pain in life, that when I did have pain, I felt a very deep connection to him. And that's when I look at my self-harm, because
Wow.
I feel such a connection to him, because my logic in my head, not the one I choose, but
That's
I
really
see him stuff.
interesting
Yeah.
way to I've never thought about, because self-harm is like not just like self-harm, cutting yourself. Self-harm is anything, self-harm is food restriction. It is an exercise addiction. And it's interesting to see your perspective on it, as like you're wanting to feel what he felt, because you feel so bad that he had to feel that way, and you want to feel that way. It's trying to almost try and take that pain away, but you can't. But it's almost like you're trying to take it away in some way, which is actually like awful, but like weirdly quite nice. It's like, do you know what I mean? Like, it's awful that you're self-harming to do that, but also comes from such a place of love and care for your dad.
Absolutely.
So what is your relationship like now with food and exercise?
Yeah. I
Would
wish
you
I
say
could
you're
say.
recovered?
I wish I could say I am, and in some ways I am. I think that with eating disorder recovery, it is so hard, and I'll tell you one thing. I really struggled to connect to resources, because one, I mean, guys are not necessarily your market when you look at eating disorders. You look at research being done. You look at not NAMI's, NEDA, their website, National Eating Disorder Association. It is very much tied to females that have the disorder, and that's wonderful, because that is a way to recover for everyone on that side. But when you have that population and you have the less resources on it, and really it's so damaging, because then when you are trying to recover, you can't really connect. You can't have that, oh, I'm going to look up to this person and I'm going to be just like this person, which is a lot of in growing up. That's part of what we do. We look for a role model. And I also went through 9 months of treatment. So 2 different times of residential treatment, to partial hospitalization, to IOP. And with that, I also was so turned off by food, and it was one of those things I had to learn to love food again. But I really haven't been able to fully, and I've been actually having more of the symptoms lately of the ARFID. So having just the lack of interest of food, and it's so hard because everything involves food in life. But it's a process, and recovery is not linear. And I think that was my biggest.
It's not linear, and I mean, it's so true. And I think with eating disorders, I definitely feel like I'm recovered. However, like, there is certain points in my life where it will get like kind of bad, but I just know how to control it now. And I recognize the behaviors, and like, it's always going to be probably the same for you. It's always going to be a way that I can control a situation that I can't control. So if I'm stressed, or like, even like moving to Australia, there was like the first few weeks, so many things were out of my control. I didn't have a place to live. I was like jet lagged. I was stressed. And like, although I didn't like do any restrictive behaviors, I felt myself feeling negative about myself, and could have easily engaged in those behaviors. And I would say that, like, an eating disorder is something that it's not something you will always remember. For example, I still to this day know the calories of like so many things, because I religiously remembered those when I did have an eating disorder. So even like when I'm looking at a menu, I will, without even realizing, thinking, I know how many calories that has. And like, it's definitely something that is all consuming, but it is a journey. But in terms of like your other disorders, and I guess just your disorders as a whole, you've been through so much, and so if anybody's listening, you know, you are an incredible role model for somebody who can, like, you may not be fully recovered, but is able to live a fairly normal life. You've created a podcast, incredible. You volunteer, like you're able to live like a, you know, like a normal person. So what are the tips that you would give to someone to manage your mental health as a whole?
So yeah, you know, and it was a whole process for me because I feel like I'm in recovery from so many of the disorders, but eating disorders and OCD will always be a struggle. Will always be one of those things that is difficult. But in terms of resources, one huge game changer in getting me into the life I am right now was an organization I found, and it is called Clubhouse International. And
It's called what, sorry?
Oh yeah, Clubhouse International.
Clubhouse International, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And what do they do?
So it's a global organization, and there's a total of roughly 340 clubhouses all over the world. And there's a location in Dayton, Ohio, and I found it called Miracle Clubhouse. And when I found this organization, the model of the organization is so complex to begin with that it is you know, it's one of those things. It's a holistic approach, and it's also non-clinical. So, you know, with clinical approaches, there's a hierarchy, and with this approach, everyone's equal. There's just enough staff members in the building to get everything running, and then all the other members work with them side by side. So when you're working side by side, you're forming relationships, and this overall, the work that's being done is so meaningful, and it meets people at all levels. When I first found it, I was cooking. I mean, that's what I thought I wanted to do originally as a career. One, because my father was a cook, but the other thing was, you know, with one of the things I started in the hospitality side of this organization. And after the anorexia, I found the advocacy side and the business side. And the thing that this organization does is it gives you a purpose in life. And one thing about recovering is you need a purpose in life. You need to find something that will give you the ability to wake up in the morning. And this organization is what made me who I am today, because I found them when I was 19 years old, and they were with me all through the eating disorder. They were with me, you know, for the rest of my life, because there is no time limits on this organization.
To this clubhouse and like engage with other people with mental illnesses, is that how it works?
Exactly. So anyone with a
cool. I've never seen this.
Yeah, there's one in I think one or two in England. There's actually Prince William just went and visited it at one point. But it's one of those things that, like, there's the individual clubhouses, but it's connected to Clubhouse International, which actually I just well, first of all, the podcast I started with them. So that is one of the biggest things I do on when I go there, and I see it as, you know, volunteer workplace, because there's no pay, and there's a specific reason for that, because, you know, it gives you more of a choice on what you're doing, and you learn things, and it's a support system within a community, and it saves so many lives. And that's how the podcast was able to get started, because a group of like-minded people decided to start one. So
I have never heard of this, and I'm actually, like, as we speak, I'm like, I wonder if this is in Australia. But
it is. Actually, we have listeners there.
It is in Australia.
Yeah. So Queensland, I believe, has one, and then I think two.
Okay.
Victoria, I think, is another one, if I'm correct. I'm not sure. It's like two above in sections of Australia.
So how often do you go to this clubhouse?
So I do 5 days a week going there, and one, it's a great opportunity for support, and then two, I have had so much ability to get involved in the model and really learning. So one thing about being a complex model is it takes a while to learn, and that's the really cool part. And there's 37 standards that tie all of the clubhouses together. So they're individual clubhouses, but they're all tied together by the 37 standards, and they're all proven. It's the World Health Organization actually, awarded them, support, and it's one of those things that
Wow.
it can change so many lives, but people don't know about it.
And is this government funded?
So there's two types of clubhouses. There's ones that are independent, and those are funded by donations, or there's also some, like in the US, some do billing Medicaid. So wanting to make sure they get some government funding as well. And then there's also ones that are with the auspice agency. And with that, so it's partnering with another organization that will fund them, partially at least, and then they get donations through the rest of it.
Wow. That's so cool. Well, thanks for sharing that, because I have a lot of listeners in the US and in the UK. So maybe in particular, those two areas, I guess will have a lot of, or have at least a few of these clubhouses. So that's really good advice for anybody struggling.
If you go to Clubhouse International's website, just search Clubhouse International. There's an interactive map that will show you the locations all over the world.
Incredible. Well, hopefully some of the listeners will go in and head over and have a look at that page. But I guess coming to the end of the podcast, we've had a really amazing conversation, and thank you for being so open and sharing about your journey. I think it's incredible that you're still sat here today, bearing in mind everything that you've been through. And that leads nicely on to the final question for potentially someone who is struggling like you were at some of your darkest moments. What is the one piece of advice that you would give them?
Really good question right there. And one thing is, rock bottom is not your enemy. There's nothing about it that should be looked on negatively, because oftentimes our deepest and darkest moments, when we just hit that moment where we know nothing's working in our life, we know that we might be at the very, last wits of what we're doing. Those are the moments that you learn the most about yourself. You look into your life, you find the strength that you didn't know happened. And I think there's such a negative tone when we think of rock bottom. We associate it sometimes with addiction and hitting that rock bottom. But as someone who's gone through rock bottom processes for 16 years now, you can learn so much about yourself and find that strength and find that connection, and it's okay to get help, and not just with the rock bottom part. But my last thing would be, if you're a guy, there's such strong expectations that showing your emotions and showing any sort of weakness that is part of society's standards, it's not something you should be listening to. I think that the best moments of my life were breaking down and breaking that stigma that I at one point had of myself. I realized that that's just something that's not good with life, because anyone can show their emotions and have that part where they can ask for help, and then really look at, it's okay to cry sometimes. It's okay to admit that you're wrong. It's okay to really be, vulnerable. And it's one of those things that it's the most rewarding process you would find if you just break it down and not listen to everyone else about it.
Yeah, I think that's incredible advice. And I think something that you mentioned there about hitting rock bottom, I used to look at my experiences like, oh, I'm a victim, I've been through this, I've been through that, and see it really negatively, which is obviously, it is a negative experience. However, I think the growth that you have from hitting rock bottom, like you said, is incredible. And it's a journey from hitting rock bottom, and you're on a journey, I'm on a journey now, and it makes you appreciate life so much more. And most importantly, it makes you be a much more empathetic person. And if you can use your experience and turn it into something positive, like creating a podcast or using your voice to try and change mental health, or well, not change it, but to create more awareness around it. I think the experience isn't so much like, why have I been through this? I actually look at my experience and I'm not glad that I've been through it, but I don't think I would be the person that I am today if I hadn't. So yeah, I think that was a really nice summary of it that you said about hitting rock bottom and not being, and that's not a bad thing. It actually could be one of the most amazing things that could happen to you if you change your view on it, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely. And looking at perspective, and when you do hit rock bottom and it's your first time, there's a lot of things that you might think is scary, but oftentimes I remember hitting it at one point and you just feel that feeling in your gut that you know what's next, you know what you have to do. And with eating disorders,
exactly.
It's like that. So I think that it's not to be scared of it, and if you need help, just ask for it, because there's people that have gone through rock bottom so many times and they're very open to sharing it.
Yeah, well, you being one of them, so thank you for coming on here and talking about your experience. I've loved speaking to you today. Please, listeners, go and check out Brandon's podcast. Is it available on just Spotify or any other channels?
So we have a wide variety, so pretty much everything but Apple podcast. We're on everything else.
Amazing. Well, I will definitely go and have a listen as well. But yeah, thank you again so much for being here and being open, and I'm sure that your experience will help lots of people who are listening to this podcast today.
And absolutely. And also, one thing I will also say is, for our podcast, Empower Half an Hour, if you go to our social media, just follow that and help, the more people we get there, just like, your dose, the more of a following you create, and working
the more
together.
People we can help.
Exactly. Because it's one thing to just listen, but supporting makes the work that we do so much more rewarding, knowing that there's things that are happening in the community that we've made a difference. And it's not about as many people as possible, it's about one person. That's all you need to help, just one person.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
I will make sure to leave a link to your Instagram and also your podcast in the bio as well, if anyone wants to go directly from here to either of those pages.
Perfect. Thank you.